All right, with the development in the brain, the basic architecture of the brain is assembled in the first two trimesters. The neural tube, it forms at about 18 to 24 days after conception, develops out of the ectoderm that we talked about last time. It is a thin, hollow tube in the embryo's back. Once this neural tube has closed, neurogenesis begins to take place, and this is a massive growth of neurons, nerve cells, and those will handle information processing at the cellular level at the brain. With neuronal migration, this involves the cells moving outward from their origin to their appropriate locations, creating different levels, structures, regions of the brain. So they start close by, and then they start to move out to where they're going to develop into whatever parts of the brain that they're going to become. At birth, this is pretty amazing, babies have approximately 100 billion neurons. I mean, that's an insane amount. Related to this also, maybe some defects could become apparent at this time. There are two birth defects that related to the failure of the closing of this neural tube. One of them you've probably heard of, Spina Bifida. So if you think about that, it's the idea of back there in the spine and things not being quite closed up. That's Spina Bifida, and that is related to this neural tube not closing up all the way. And with spina bifida, it can result in varying degrees of paralysis of the lower limbs. For some people, it's not really that dramatic. For some people, it is really dramatic. One strategy that can help to prevent the neural tube defects is for women to take adequate amounts of folic acid. So you may have heard of this. Pregnant women take folic acid. This is a B vitamin. And so, yes, it's necessary for development, proper development. In the other defect that could happen in the neural tube, the brain actually fails to develop and the infant will die in the womb or during childbirth or very shortly after childbirth. So when we were talking earlier in the last chapter, the idea of doing some of the tests, this is one of the tests that it could check for to see if this neural tube has closed up or not. In spina bifida, again, you could live with that just fine. But with this other one is called Anacephaly, by the way, Anacephaly. And so if you have Anacephaly, this is the one that the baby is going to die either in the womb or shortly after childbirth. All right, some other things that can happen during this time period. The term for this is teratology. What we're looking at is terotogens, is what they're called, and they're hazards to prenatal development. And these are several of them that you can look through here. We'll talk about some of these. Terotogen is any agent that can cause a birth defect or negatively alter cognitive or behavioral outcomes for the child. The study of field for this is teratology, and what they're looking at with these things is the dose, like how much you're going to get of whatever terotogen you get here, the genetic susceptibility, and the time of exposure, because that matters too. Like for some things, the first trimester is terrible. For the third, things are more complicated. So we're looking at the dose, genetic susceptibility, time of exposure to see how, to detect it and see how severe the damage is going to be. The probability of structural defect is the greatest in the embryonic period. So we talked about those periods earlier. Structural defects, the greatest is in the embryonic period. After organogenesis is complete, the terotogens are less likely to cause anatomical defects. Exposure during the fetal period is more likely to stunt growth or cause problems in the way that the organs are formed. And so here we have I believe this is figure 5. This talks a little bit about the greatest sensitivity to terotogens and then less sensitivity. And so you'll notice things are really here. The red is the greatest sensitivity. So from 3 to 5 weeks, the limbs, eyes, and the heart have greater sensitivity to these terotogens. And so then if you were to look at 26 to 36 or 20 to 36 weeks, the teeth, less sensitivity to terotogens, but could still possibly be significant. Something that I find really interesting here is that here during these first 2 weeks, some of the research says that you don't have as much sensitivities to these terotogens. So we'll get into some of the psychoactive substances that some people have used during their pregnancies. There is evidence that says, if you were to, let's say you drank too much in the first week while the baby was being formed, it might not be that significant compared to if you're drinking alcohol during this period, which is also good because a lot of people, when they are pregnant here and kind of in this area, they don't know they're pregnant. Once you get into here, even some people don't know they're pregnant. So it's something to be mindful of, that here at the 4th week, this is still going to has the potential to be very damaging, and you might not even know you're pregnant. Okay, so some of these terogens that we're talking about, both prescription and non-prescription drugs, can have effects on the fetus. Psychoactive drugs, which act on the nervous system, these include caffeine. Some people aren't aware of that. Caffeine, alcohol, nicotine, and then illicit drugs, illegal drugs like cocaine, methamphetamines. They all have a wide variety of negative effects on the embryo, fetus. One particularly bad one is fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. It's a cluster of abnormalities and problems that appear in offspring of mothers who have drank alcohol heavily during their pregnancy. If you want to go look that up, a little bit more on your time, feel free. It's a terrible disease and you do not want your kid to have that. Another one is there could be issues with blood types. This is kind of interesting. An incompatibility between the mother's and the father's blood types can pose a risk. One difference is in the blood cells, and they're called Rh positive and Rh negative blood. And so if you have this Rh incompatibility, basically the mother perceives that blood of the father to be a threat and tries to get rid of it, essentially. The immune system tries to fight it off, produce antibodies that can actually threaten the fetus. So that's pretty interesting. And it's kind of strange. Usually the first Rh positive baby is not at risk, but it's with each subsequent pregnancy that the risk increases. There is a vaccine that can be given to the mother and blood transfusions that can be given to the baby to try to offset that immune response. You probably are aware of this, environmental hazards. This can include radiation, toxic waste, other chemical pollutants. Example, X-ray radiation. Those could affect a developing embryo or fetus. There are also maternal diseases that can produce defects that will cross the placenta barrier during birth. So, for example, rubella, that's the German measles. Those can cause prenatal defects. Syphilis can cause eye lesions and skin lesions. And then this is interesting to me. So genital herpes, they can be contracted by the newborns that are born vaginally. And the kids that get the herpes this early on, about a third of them will die. So, that's profound. And then a fourth of them will go on to, the fourth of the ones that live will go on to have brain damage. So if you have genital herpes, it's definitely going to be preferred to have a C-section instead of having a vaginal birth. And then women also, their diet can have an effect, or the idea of having gestational diabetes. And when you have this, it could produce, the fetuses can become very large, and you would have a very large infant when they're first born. And then that can put them at risk for diabetes themselves. And then also a mother, kind of related back to the diseases, a mother can infect her offspring with HIV/AIDS in 3 different ways. One, during gestation in the placenta, in delivery with contact with the maternal blood or fluids, and then postpartum after the kid's born through breastfeeding. Okay, on the maternal diet, this can also affect the development of the fetus, obviously. Obesity can adversely affect the pregnancy outcomes. If we talked a little bit about it earlier, women that are pregnant should have folic acid and fish. So this should be consumed with caution because, and you probably heard this before, some fish has very high levels of mercury, and that can cause negative developmental outcomes. And just another kind of risk factor here is the older women get, and when they become pregnant, the more chances there are for negative developmental outcomes. And this is especially true once women reach about 35 or so or older. So, for example, the risk for Down syndrome increases with age. It is 1 in 100 when you are 40 years old. So that's pretty high, 1 in 100 at 40 years old. Once you get to 50 years old, that becomes 1 in 10. So that's very high. Some other issues that could come up if a woman is to experience intense fears, anxieties, and or depression, there's physiological changes that can happen to her that will end up affecting the fetus. And that can actually cause essentially stress, prenatal stress. And the potential consequences that can happen there could include emotional, cognitive problems, ADHD, language development, preterm birth, lower weight even. As far as stress goes, it's something that we kind of ignore. We don't want to ignore it, but we don't think of it as as much of a medical problem as probably we should. So, stress should be considered just as important as diet, things of that nature. Stress should be definitely something that we consider during a pregnancy. And finally, there are also some parental risk factors from the father. So, if men are exposed to lead or radiation, certain types of pesticides, it can cause abnormalities in genetic changes in the sperm. So then their kids that are born are going to, have some type of developmental outcome from that. We talked a little bit about that with the epigenetic changes early in the semester. Fathers smoking during pregnancy can cause problems for the offspring. And children that are born to fathers who are 40 or older have increased risks of developing certain things. And one thing is in autism. And so what's going on there is probably there's some type of like DNA damage. The older you are, the more damaged you're going to be. When they say this is like on average 40 or older, they have an increased risk to autism. They don't kind of divvy this out in the research they go through in the textbook. But how did the father live? If the father is, working with lead or something like that, yes, they're probably going to have, more like DNA damage to their bodies. But, if you have a man that maybe is taking care of themselves, I think that's going to mitigate some of that. All right, that is the end of the teratogens section. Next, we will get into prenatal care and development.